Welcome to Voices and Volumes, the podcast that brings you forgotten stories from the 1800s back to life. I'm Avril, and today's episode is a BARE recital, where instead of my usual deep dive into the historical context and background of my ancient books, I simply read you the original material without interruption or commentary. This is a chance for you to relax, a time to hear those forgotten voices, and an opportunity to hear the full text that I selected from the regular episodes. Today I'll be reading Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland by Thomas Crofton Croker. This book was written in 1838, and this chapter is Chapter 13, Legends of the Banshee. The family of McCarthy have for some generation possessed a small estate in the county of Tipperary. They are the descendants of a race once numerous and powerful in the south of Ireland, and though it is probable that the property that they present hold is no part of the large possessions of their ancestors, yet the district in which they live is so connected with the name of McCarthy by those associations which are never forgotten in Ireland, they have preserved with all ranks a sort of influence much greater than that which their fortune or connections could otherwise give them. They are, like most of this class, of the Roman Catholic persuasion, to which they adhere with somewhat of a pride of ancestry, blended with a something, call it what you will, whether bigotry or a sense of wrong arising out of the repeated diminutions of their family possessions during the more rigorous periods of the penal laws. Being an old family, and especially being an old Catholic family, they have, of course, their Banshee. And the circumstances under which the appearance, which I shall relate in this mysterious harbinger of death, took place, were told by me by an old lady, a near connection of theirs, who knew many of their parties concerned, and who, though not deficient in understanding or education, cannot to this day be brought to give a decisive opinion as to the truth or authenticity of the story. The plain inference to be drawn from this is that she believes it, though she does not own it. And as she was a contemporary of the persons concerned, as she heard the account from many persons of the same period, all concurring in the important particulars, as some of her authorities were themselves actors in the scene, and as none of the parties were interested in speaking of what was false, I think we have about as good evidence that the whole is undeniably true, as we may have many narratives of modern history, which I could name, and which many grave and sober-minded people would deem it a very great Pyrrhonism to question. This, however, is a point which it is not my province to determine. People who deal out stories of this sort must be content to act like a certain young politicians who tell very freely to their friends what they hear at the great man's table, not guilty of the impertinence of weighing the doctrines and leaving it to their hearers to understand them in any sense, or in no sense, just as they may please. Charles McCarthy was, in the year of 1749, the only surviving son of a very numerous family. His father died when he was little more than 20, leaving him the McCarthy estate not much encumbered, considering that it was an Irish one. Charles was gay and handsome, unfettered, either by poverty, a father, or guardians, and therefore was not, at the age of 21, a pattern of regularity and virtue. In plain terms, he was exceedingly dissipated. I fear I may say debauched young man. His companions were, as may be supposed, of the higher classes of the youth in his neighbourhood, and in general of those whose fortunes were larger than his own, whose dispositions to pleasure were therefore under still less restrictions, and those whose example he found at once as an incentive and apology for his irregularities. Besides, Ireland, a place to this day not very remarkable for the coolness and steadiness of its youth, was then one of the cheapest countries in the world in most of those articles which money supplies for indulgence of the passions. The odious exciseman, with his pretentious book in one hand and his unrelenting pen held in the other, or stuck beneath his hatband the ink bottle, black emblem of the informer, dangling from his waistcoat button, went not from alehouse to alehouse denouncing all these patriotic dealers in spirits who preferred selling whisky, which had nothing to do with English laws, but to elude them, to retailing that poisonous liquor which derived its name from the British Parliament that compelled its circulation amongst the reluctant people. Or, if the gauger, recording angel of the law, wrote down the peccadillo of a publican, he dropped a tear upon the world and blotted it out for ever. For, welcome to the tables of their hospitable neighbours, the guardians of excise, where they existed at all, scrupled to abridge those luxuries which they freely shared, and thus the competition in the market between the smuggler, who incurred little hazard, and the personage eclipsed fair trader who enjoyed little protection made Ireland a land flowing not merely with milk and honey, but with whisky and wine. In the enjoyment supplied by these and the many kindred pleasures to which frail youth is but too prone, Charles McCarthy indulged to such a degree that just about the time when he had completed his 24th year, after a week of great excess, he was seized with a violent fever, which, from its malignity and the weakness of his frame, left scarcely a hope of his recovery. His mother, who at first had made many efforts to check his vices, and at last had been obliged to look on at his rapid progress to ruin in silent despair, watched day and night at his pillow. The anguish of parental feeling was blended with that still deeper misery which those only know who have striven hard to rear in virtue and piety a beloved and favoured child, have found him grow up all that their hearts could desire until he reached manhood, and then, when their pride was at the highest, their hopes almost ended in the fulfilment of their fondest expectations, have seen this idol of their affections plunge headlong into a courser profligacy, and after a rapid career of vice, hanging upon the verge of eternity without the leisure for or the power of repentance. Fervently she prayed that, if his life could not be spared, at least the delirium which continued with increasing violence from the first few hours of his disorder might vanish before death, and leave enough of light and calm for making his peace with offended heaven. After several days, however, nature seemed quite exhausted, and he sunk into a state too like death to be mistaken for a repose of sleep. His face had that pale, glossy marble look which is generally so sure a symptom that life has left its tenant of clay. His eyes were closed and sunk, the lids having that of compressed and stiffened appearance which seemed to indicate that some friendly hand had done its last office. The lips, half closed, perfectly ashy, discovered just so much of the teeth as to give the features of death their most ghastly but most impressive look. He lay upon his back with his hands stretched beside him, quite motionless, and his distracted mother, after repeated trials, could discover not the least symptom of animation. The medical man who attended, having tried the usual modes for ascertaining the presence of life, declared at last his opinion that it was flown, and prepared to depart from the house of mourning. His horse was seen to come to the door. A crowd of people who were collected before the windows or scattered in groups on the lawn in front gathered round when the door opened. These were tenants, fosterers, and poor relations of the family, who others attracted by affection or by that interest which partakes of curiosity, but is something more, and which collects the lower ranks around the house where a human being is in his passage to another world. They saw the professional man come out from the hall door and approach his horse, and while slowly and with melancholy air he prepared to mount, they clustered round him with inquiring and wishful looks. Not a word was spoken, but their meaning could not be misunderstood. And the physician, while he had got into his saddle, and while the servant was still holding the bridle as if to delay him, and was looking anxiously at his face, as if expecting that he would relieve the general suspense, shook his head and said in a low voice, "It is all over, James," and moved slowly away. The moment he had spoken, the women present, who were very numerous, uttered a shrill cry which, having been sustained for about half a minute, fell suddenly into a flood of loud, continued and discordant but plaintive wailing, above which occasionally were heard in the deep sounds of a man's voice, sometimes in broken sobs, sometimes in more distinct exclamations of sorrow. This was Charles's foster brother, who moved about in the crowd, now clapping his hands, now rubbing them together in an agony of grief. The poor fellow had been Charles's playmate and companion when a boy, and afterwards his servant, had always been distinguished by a particular regard, and loved his young master as much, at least, as he did his own life. When Mrs. McCarthy became convinced that the blow was indeed struck, and that her beloved son was sent to his last account, even in the blossoms of his sin, she remained for some time gazing with fixedness upon his cold features. Then, as if something had suddenly touched the string of her tenderest affections, tear after tear trickled down her cheeks, pale with anxiety and watching. Still she continued looking at her son, apparently unconscious that she was weeping without once lifting her handkerchief to her eyes, until, reminded of the sad duties which the custom of the country imposed upon her by the crowd of females belonging to the better class of the peasantry, who now, crying audibly, nearly filled the apartment. She then withdrew to give directions for the ceremony of walking, and for supplying the numerous visitors of all ranks with refreshments usual on those melancholy occasions. Though her voice was scarcely heard, and though no one saw her but the servants and one or two old followers of the family who assisted her in the necessary arrangements, everything was conducted with the gravest regularity. And though she made no effort to check her sorrows, they never once suspended her attention. Now more than ever required to preserve order in her household, which, in the season of calamity, but for her would have been all confusion. The night was pretty far advanced. The boisterous lamentations which had prevailed during that part of the day in and about the house had given the place a solemn and mournful stillness, and Miss McCarthy, whose heart, notwithstanding a long fatigue and watching, was yet too sore for sleep, was kneeling in fervent prayer in a chamber adjoining that of her son. Suddenly her devotees were disturbed by an unusual noise proceeding from the persons who were watching round the body. First there was a low murmur, then it was all silent, as if movements of those in the chamber were checked by a sudden panic, and then a loud cry of terror burst from all within. The door of the chamber was thrown open, and those who were not overturned in the press rushed wildly into the passage which led to the stairs, and into which Miss McCarthy's room opened. Miss McCarthy made her way through the crowd into her son's chamber, where she found him sitting up in the bed and looking vacantly around like one risen from the grave. The glare thrown upon his sunk features, thin, lazy frame, gave an unearthly horror to his whole aspect. Miss McCarthy was a woman of some firmness, but she was a woman, and not quite free from superstitions of her country. She dropped on her knees and, clasping her hands, began to pray aloud. The form before her moved only its lips and barely uttered, "Mother." But though the pale lips moved, as if there was a design to finish the sentence, the tongue refused its office. Miss McCarthy sprung forward and, catching the arm of her son, exclaimed, "Speak! In the name of God and the saints, speak! Are you alive?" He turned to her slowly and said, speaking still with apparent difficulty, "Yes, my mother, alive, but sit down and collect yourself. I have to tell you which will astonish you still more than you have seen." He leaned back upon his pillow, and while his mother remained kneeling beside the bedside, holding one of his hands clasped in hers, and gazing on him with the look of one who distrusts all her senses, he proceeded, "Do not interrupt me until I have done. I wish to speak while the excitement of returning to life is upon me, as I know I shall soon need much repose. Of the commencement of my illness I have only confused recollection, but with the last 12 hours I have been before the judgment seat of God. Do not stare incredulous on me. 'Tis as true as I've been many crimes, and as I trust shall be my repentance. I saw the awful judge arrayed in all the terrors which invest him when mercy gives place to justice. The dreadful pomp of offended omnipotence I saw, I remember. It's fixed here, printed on my brain, in characters indelible, but it passeth human language. What I can describe, I will. I may speak it briefly. It is enough to say, I was weighted in the balance and found wanting. The irrevocable sentence was upon the point of being pronounced. The eye of the Almighty Judge, which had already glanced upon me, half spoke my doom. When I observed the guardian saint to whom you so often directed my prayers when I was a child, looking at me with expression of benevolence and compassion, I stretched forth my hands to him and besought his intercession. I implored that 1 year, 1 month might be given to me on earth to do penance and atonement for my transgressions. He threw himself at the feet of my judge and supplicated for mercy. Oh, never, not if I should pass through 10,000 successive states of being, never for eternity, shall I forget the horrors of that moment when my fate hung suspended, when an instant was to decide whether torments unutterable were to be my portion for endless ages. But justice suspended its decree, and mercy spoke in accents of firmness but mildness. Return to that world in which thou hast lived, but to outrage the laws of him who made that world in thee. 3 years I give, and 3 for repentance. These are ended. Thou shalt again stand here to be saved or lost forever. I heard no more, I saw no more, until I awoke to life the moment before you entered. Charles's strength continued just long enough to finish these last words, and on uttering them he closed his eyes and lay quite exhausted. His mother, though, as was before said, somewhat disposed to give credit to supernatural visitations, yet hesitated whether or not she should believe that, although awakened from a swoon which might have been the crisis of his disease, he was still under the influence of delirium. Repose, however, was at all events necessary, and she took immediate measures that he should enjoy it undisturbed. After some hours' sleep, he awoke refreshed, and thenceforth gradually but steadily recovered. Still he persisted in his account of the vision, as he had at first related it, and his persuasion of its reality had an obvious and decided influence on his habits and conduct. He did not altogether abandon society for his former associates, for his temper was not soured by his reformation, but he never joined in their excesses, and often endeavoured to reclaim them. How his pious exertions succeeded I have never learned, but of himself it's recorded that he was religious without ostentation, and temperate without austerity, giving a practical proof that vice may be exchanged for virtue without loss of respectability, popularity, or happiness. Time rolled on, and long before 3 years were ended, the story of his vision forgotten, or when spoken of usually mentioned as an instance proving the folly of believing in such things. Charles's health from the temperance and regularity of his habits became more robust than ever. His friends, indeed, had often occasion to rally him upon a serious and abstractedness of demeanour which grew upon him as he approached the completion of his 27th year. But for this most part his manner exhibited the same animation and cheerfulness for which he always had been remarkable. In company he evaded every endeavour to draw from him a distinct opinion on the subject of supposed prediction, but among his own family it was well known that he still firmly believed it. However, when the day had nearly arrived on which the prophecy was, if at all, to be fulfilled, his whole appearance gave such promise of a long and healthy life that he was persuaded by his friends to ask a large party to an entertainment at Spring House to celebrate his birthday. But the occasion of this party and the circumstances which attended it will be best learned from a perusal of the following letters, which have been carefully preserved by some relations of his family. The first is from Miss McCarthy to a lady, a very near connection and valued friend of hers, who lived in the county of Cork, at about 50 miles distance from Spring House. To Mrs. Barry, Castlebarry, Spring House, Tuesday morning, October 15, 1752. My dearest Mary, I am afraid I am going to put your affection for your old friend and kinswoman to a severe trial. A 2 days' journey at this season, over bad roads and through a troubled country, it will indeed require friendship such as yours to persuade a sober woman to encounter. But the truth is, I have, or I fancy I have, more than usual cause for wishing you near me. You know my son's story. I cannot tell you how it is, but as next Sunday approaches, when the prediction of his dream or his vision will be proved false or true, I feel a sickening of the heart, which I cannot suppress, but which your presence, my dear Mary, will soften, as it has done so many of my sorrows. My nephew, James Ryan, is to be married to Jane Osborne, who you know is my son's ward, and the bridal entertainment will take place here on Sunday next, though Charles pleaded hard to have it postponed a day or 2 longer. Would to God, but no more of this till we meet. Do prevail upon yourself to leave your good man for 1 week, if his farming concerns will not admit of his accompanying you, and come to us, with the girls, as soon as before Sunday as you can. Ever my dear Mary's attached cousin and friend, Anne McCarthy. Although this letter reached Castlebarry early on Wednesday, the messenger having travelled on foot over bog and moor by paths impassable to horse and carriage, Mrs. Barry, who at once determined on going, had so many arrangements to make for the regulation of her domestic affairs, which in Ireland among the middle orders of the gentry fall soon into confusion when the mistress of the family is away, that she and her 2 young daughters were unable to leave home until late on the morning of Friday. The eldest daughter remained to keep her father company and superintended the concerns of the household. As the travellers were to journey in an open one-horse vehicle called a jaunting cart, still used in Ireland, and the roads, bad at times, were rendered still worse by the heavy rains, it was their design to make 2 easy stages, to stop about midway first night and reach Spring House early on Saturday evening. This arrangement was now altered, as they found that from the lateness of the departure they could proceed at utmost no further than 20 miles on the first day, and they were therefore purposed sleeping at a house of Mr. Burke, a friend of theirs, who lived at somewhat less than that distance from Castlebarry. They reached Miss Burke's in safety after rather a disagreeable drive. What befell them on the journey the next day to Spring House after their arrival there is fully related in a letter from the second Miss Barry to her eldest sister. Spring House, Sunday evening, 20th October, 1752. Dear Ellen, as my mother's letter, the sad intelligence which I shall here relate more fully, I think it better to go regularly through the recital of the extraordinary events of the last 2 days. The Burkes kept us so late on Friday night that yesterday was pretty far advanced before we could begin our journey, and the day closed when we were nearly 15 miles distant from this place. The roads were excessively deep from heavy rains of the last week, and we proceeded slowly, that at last my mother resolved on passing the night at the house of Mr. Burke's brother, who lives about 1/4 of a mile off the road, and coming here to breakfast in the morning. The day had been windy and showery, and the sky looked fitful, gloomy and uncertain. The moon was full and at times shone clear and bright, and others it was wholly concealed behind thick, black and rugged masses of clouds that rolled rapidly along, and were every moment becoming larger and collecting together as if gathering strength for a coming storm. The wind, which blew in our faces, whisked bleakly along the low hedges of the narrow road, which we proceeded with difficulty from the number of deep sloughs, which afforded not the least shelter. No plantation being within some miles of us, my mother therefore asked Leary, who drove the jaunting car, how far we were from Mr. Burke's. "'Tis about 10 spades from this to the cross, and we have then only to turn up the left of the road to the avenue, ma'am." "Very well, Leary. Turn up to Mr. Burke's as soon as you reach the crossroads." My mother had scarcely spoken these words when a shriek that made us thrill as if our very hearts were pierced by it burst from the hedge to the right of our way. If it resembled anything earthly, it seemed the cry of a female struck by a sudden and mortal blow, and giving out her life in one long deep pang of expiring agony. "Heaven defend us!" exclaimed my mother. "Go you over the hedge, Leary, and save that woman if she's not yet dead, while we run back to the hut we just passed, and alarm the village near it." "Woman," said Leary, beating the horse violently while his voice trembled. "That's no woman. The sooner we get on, ma'am, the better." And he continued his efforts to quicken the horse's pace. We saw nothing. The moon was hid. It was quite dark, and then we had been for some time expecting a heavy fall of rain. But just as Leary had spoken, and had succeeded in making the horse trot briskly forward, we distinctly heard a loud clapping of hands, followed by a succession of screams that seemed to denote the last excess of despair and anguish, and to issue from a person running forward inside the hedge to keep pace with our progress. Still we saw nothing, until, when we were within about 10 yards of the place, where an avenue branched off to Mr. Burke's to the left and the road turned to Spring House on the right, the moon started suddenly from behind a cloud and enabled us to see, as plainly as I now see this paper, the figure of a tall, thin woman, with uncovered head, and her long hair that floated round her shoulders, attired in something which seemed either a loose white cloak or a sheet thrown hastily about her. She stood on the corner hedge where the road on which we were met, that which leads to Spring House, with her face towards us, and her left hand pointing to this place, and her right arm waving rapidly and violently as if to draw us on in that direction. The horse had stopped, apparently frightened at the sudden presence of the figure, which stood in the manner I have described, still uttering the same piercing cries for about half a minute. It then leaped upon the road, disappeared from our view for one instant, and the next was seen standing upon a high wall a little way up the avenue, on which we proposed going, still pointing towards the road to Spring House, but in an attitude of defiance and command, as if prepared to oppose our passage up the avenue. The figure was now quite silent, and its garments, which had before flown loosely in the wind, were closely wrapped around it. "Go on, Leary, to Spring House, in God's name," said my mother. "Whatever world it belongs to, we will provoke it no longer." "'Tis the Banshee, ma'am," said Leary, "and I would not, for what my life is worth, go anywhere this blessed night but to Spring House. But I'm afraid there's something bad going forward, or she would not send us there." So saying, he drove forward, and he turned on the road to the right. The moon suddenly withdrew its light, and we saw the apparition no more. But we heard plainly a prolonged clapping of hands, gradually dying away, as if it issued from the person rapidly retreating. We proceeded as quickly as the badness of the roads and the fatigue of the poor animal that drew us would allow, and we arrived here about 11 o'clock last night. The scene which awaited us you have learned from my mother's letter. To explain it fully, I must recount to you some of the transactions which took place here during the last week. You are aware that Jane Osborne was to have been married this day to James Ryan, and that they and their friends had been here for the last week. On Tuesday last, the very day of the morning of which cousin McCarthy dispatched the letter inviting us here, the whole of the company were walking about the grounds a little before dinner. It seems that an unfortunate creature who had been seduced by James Ryan was seen prowling the neighbourhood in a moody, melancholy state for some days previous. He had separated from her for several months, and, they say, had provided for her rather handsomely, but she had been seduced by the promise of his marrying her. And the shame of her unhappy condition, unwitting with disappointment and jealousy, had disordered her intellects. During the whole forenoon of this Tuesday she had been walking in the plantations near Spring House, with her cloak folded tight around her, the hood nearly covering her face, and she had avoided conversing with or even meeting any of the family. Charles McCarthy, at the time I mentioned, was walking between James Ryan and another, at a little distance from the rest, on the gravel path skirting the shrubbery. The whole party were thrown into the utmost consternation by the report of a pistol fired from a thickly planted part of the shrubbery, which Charles and his companions had just passed. He fell instantly, and it was found that he had been wounded in the leg. One of the party was a medical man. His assistance was immediately given, and on examining he declared that the injury was very slight, that no bone was broken, that it was merely a flesh wound, and that it would certainly be well in a few days. "We shall know more by Sunday," said Charles as he was carried to his chamber. His wound was immediately dressed, and so slight was the inconvenience that several of his friends spent a portion of the evening in his apartment. On inquiry, it was found that the unlucky shot was fired by the poor girl I just mentioned. It was also manifest that she had aimed not at Charles, but at the destroyer of her innocence and happiness who was walking beside him. After a fruitless search for her through the grounds, she walked into the house of her own accord, laughing and dancing and singing wildly at every moment, exclaiming that she had at last killed Mr. Ryan. When she heard that it was Charles and not Mr. Ryan who she shot, she fell into a violent fit, out of which, after working convulsively for some time, she sprung to the door, escaped from the crowd that pursued her, and could never be taken until last night, when she was brought here perfectly frantic a little before our arrival. Charles's wound was thought to be such of little consequence that the preparations went forward as usual for the wedding entertainment on Sunday. But on Friday night he grew restless and feverish, and on Saturday, yesterday morning, felt so ill that it was deemed necessary to obtain additional medical advice. 2 physicians and a surgeon met in consultation about 12 o'clock in the day, and the dreadful intelligence was announced that unless a charge, hardly hoped for, took place before the night, death must happen within 24 hours after. The wound, it seems, had been too tightly bandaged and otherwise injudiciously treated. The physicians were right in their anticipations. No favourable symptom appeared, and long before we reached Spring House, every ray of hope had vanished. The scene we witnessed on our arrival would have wrung the heart of a demon. We heard briefly at the gate that Mr. Charles was upon his deathbed. When we reached the house, the information was confirmed by the servant who opened the door, but just as we entered, we were horrified by the most appalling screams issuing from the staircase. My mother thought she heard the voice of the poor Miss McCarthy and sprung forward. We followed, and on ascending a few steps of the stairs we found a young woman, in a state of frantic passion, struggling furiously with 2 men servants who, united in strength hardly sufficient to prevent her rushing up the stairs over the body of Mr. McCarthy, who was lying in strong hysterics upon the steps. This, I afterwards discovered, was the unhappy girl I before described, who was attempting to gain access to Charles's room to get his forgiveness, as she said, before he went away to accuse her of having killed him. this wild idea was mingled with another which seemed to dispute the former possession of her mind. In one sentence she called on Charles to forgive her, and in the next she would denounce James Ryan as the murderer of both Charles and her. At length she was torn away, and the last words I heard her scream were, "James Ryan, 'twas you killed him and not I. 'Twas you killed him and not I." Miss McCarthy, on recovering, fell into the arms of my mother, whose presence seemed a great relief to her. She wept the first tears, I was told, that she had shed since the fatal accident. She conducted us to Charles's room, who, she said, had desired to see us the moment of our arrival. As he found his end approaching and wished to devote the last hours of existence to uninterrupted prayer and meditation, we found him perfectly calm, resigned, and even cheerful. He spoke of the awful event which was at hand with courage and confidence, and treated it as a doom for which he had been preparing ever since for his former remarkable illness, and which he never once doubted was truly foretold to him. He bade us all farewell with the air of one who was about to travel a short and easy journey, and we left him with impressions which, notwithstanding all their anguish, will, I trust, never eternally forsake us. Poor Miss McCarthy! But I am just called away. There seems to be a slight stir in the family. Perhaps— The above letter was never finished. The enclosure, to which it more than once alludes, told the sequel briefly, and it is all that I have further learned from this branch of the McCarthy family. Before the sun had gone down on Charles's 27th birthday, his soul had gone to render its last account to its creator. And that concludes today's BARE recital. If you'd like to learn more about this historical context, the authors, or the world that produced these words, be sure to check out my regular episodes where I explore the deeper stories behind these forgotten volumes. This has been Voices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening.